Perfect Dark is one of the highest rated games of all time. Released by Rare for the Nintendo 64 in 2000, it quickly became a landmark title for the system, as well as console multiplayer in general. It was originally conceived after the release of Rareware's iconic GoldenEye 007 game. They wanted to make a first-person shooter similar to their previous title, but didn't want it to be restricted by licensing. A sequel to GoldenEye wouldn't have likely come to light anyway, since EA acquired the license to James Bond games in 1998. Which they used to make classic games like 007 Racing. Despite a few issues with the Nintendo 64's hardware, Perfect Dark's development went pretty well and sold over 2.5 million units, being the 19th best-selling game on the system. The requirement for the expansion pack, as well as being released later in the console's life, probably led to less sales. A prequel called Perfect Dark Zero was released in 2005, and as of a reboot was just announced at the Game Awards, and I don't have much to say about it, but it'll be interesting to see how the series will fare since it hasn't had a game in over 15 years. Now, the first game was exclusive to the N64, and I don't have one, so I can't play it in the way it was initially released. Though thankfully for me, a remastered version of the original game was put on the Xbox Live Arcade in 2010, and that's the version I'll be playing. As for the remaster itself, it's pretty incredible. 4J Studios, yes the Minecraft guys, improved the game in so many ways. The frame rate is no longer like a slideshow, voice lines are clearer, and while it's certainly not great looking, the graphics and character models are much better. Other Rare games got a similar treatment, but this one by far needed it the most. So into the game, and I haven't even started playing yet, but I already have a problem with the menu. Now if you haven't played Perfect Dark, you're probably wondering, what is a Carrington Institution, what's a combat simulator, and counter-operative sounds really cool. I thought this at first too, and so I will explain. The Carrington Institution is this sort of open tutorial area that you can walk around in. Combat Simulator is multiplayer and it could do with a better name, even though I know they're trying to go for a sort of training facility style with the computer and all. Then solo missions, cooperative and counter-operative should have been grouped into story or campaign. And yes, counter-operative is exactly what it sounds like. A mode where the first player is going through the story missions normally, but the second plays as the much weaker enemies and tries to stop the first player. It's a really cool idea that I wish was tried in more games, but sadly it isn't. Multiplayer was obviously where a lot of the appeal came from when Perfect Dark came out because of how similar it was to GoldenEye, but nowadays it feels a lot more novel in my opinion. I guess it just had the unfortunate circumstance of being an early game in a genre that rapidly evolved over the next 20 years. That being said, there's still fun to be had, though the controls can be a bit weird to get used to. A strange thing Rare did with their first-person shooters was have it so that the look stick moves your reticle across the screen but snaps back into the center once you let go, which is a really weird thing to get used to, and I kinda wish 4J made a control scheme that changed this to be more like modern FPSs, but I guess that would have changed the game a bit too much, even though one gun's secondary mode lets you do this basically. The weapon balancing is very much all over the place. Some guns are clearly overpowered, but I don't think this was made with a competitive scene in mind. All weapons have a secondary mode, which can vary from a basic melee attack to a grenade launcher. One of my favourites turned your gun into a bomb. It was cool, but you did lose the gun. Furthermore, this added the cool excitement to trying out a new gun and figuring out what its secondary did. The maps weren't particularly great. Many of them were a bit too large and I'd spend a lot of time just walking around. The separate areas looked very similar as well, so it was often difficult trying to navigate them. Likewise, the AI wasn't the smartest. They're really easy to kill and the highest difficulty you can put them on is normal, but this is a 20-year-old game. Perfect Dark wouldn't be my first choice for local multiplayer, but there is still some enjoyment to be found, even if it is dated, clunky, teaching your friends how to play type enjoyment. For the single player, Perfect Dark is a deceivingly simple story that goes to a lot of places you wouldn't expect. Initially appearing to be similar to James Bond, with you playing as a British agent named Joanna in some very movie-like first few levels. This all gets turned on its head though when you have to single-handedly raid Area 51 and meet an alien called Elvis who speaks like Yoda from Star Wars. The game then suddenly becomes a lot more sci-fi, with you eventually going to space. It's not an amazing plot and can be a bit confusing at times, but it's very fleshed out for a Nintendo 64 game. The campaign is about 18 levels divided into 9 missions with 4 unlockable bonus levels. Extra levels are a very cool reward for playing on higher difficulties, but I understand why most developers wouldn't want to keep an entire level from players who didn't want to play through the game on the hardest difficulty. And Perfect Dark is pretty tough, to the point where I'd probably recommend playing through the later parts of the story on the easiest difficulty. Even then it's more of a normal mode by today's standards. You also get extra objectives for playing on higher difficulties, which is a nice idea, but I never felt that any of them were that great, so you aren't missing out on much. I think the first half of Perfect Dark is a lot better than the second, with Air Force 1 being the last really fun level. After that they become way too big and maze-like, which highlights one of Rareware's problems at the time, which was their idea of trying to innovate by just making their games grander and more open. You can see this in Banjo Tooie in particular. Bigger levels feel a lot slower because they're overwhelming and involve a lot of getting from place to place, which leads to slower progress, which leads to less satisfaction. It feels a lot better to be able to run around in Banjo-Kazooie collecting 10 individual music notes in one area than getting 5 at once in Tooie and having to go across an empty area of nothing to get to the other. Similar case with Perfect Dark. It's more satisfying to be able to get things done relatively quickly than having to walk around for 10 minutes between each objective. So to summarise, in smaller levels you're confined and have everything relatively close, but in bigger ones everything is more spread out, so progress feels slower and more tedious. Moreover, this leads to something that the game aged really poorly in, being its lack of guidance. From the very start, Perfect Dark gives the player little idea of what exactly to do, and apart from a small description, it trusts you to figure out things for yourself. You do explore every level thoroughly because of this, but that's the only benefit I can think of. I know people complain about too much hand-holding in games nowadays, but PD really doesn't have enough. I'm pretty sure I used a guide for at least half the levels, so the fun was often overshadowed by confusion. Objective markers would have been good, or at least have the dialogue give you a clue on what you're meant to do. This did happen, but very rarely. Ha 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 ha. Another big thing that annoyed me, especially near the end, was how cruel the game was. I actually didn't mind it in the first couple levels, because if you know what to do they can be beaten very quickly, but once again the latter half is where it started to annoy me because of the bigger, longer levels. The final mission was the height of this problem. You only fight Skedar here, which are the evil aliens basically, and they can take a lot of hits. The Skedar with guns can kill you in about a second, you have to throw trackers on pillars, if you misplace one you can't continue, and the final boss is absolutely evil. By my 30th attempt I generally wanted to assassinate him. Like, come on, why didn't anyone at Rare think giving him a rocket launcher that can instantly kill you with unlimited ammo was a little cheap? And the fact that the way in which you're supposed to kill him isn't that obvious makes this even worse. You have to get his health down, wait for him to start healing, and then shoot the spikes in front of him in a particular order. Thank me later. I spent over 2 hours on this level alone, and the satisfaction of beating it was pretty great, so maybe the cruel death to start system gave me that. As for things I did like, the sound design and the weapons was great, and the amount of voice clips is impressive for a Nintendo 64 game. The enemies also have a lot of reactions to different things. You can even straight up shoot guns out of their hands if you're lucky. It's unique things such as this that Rare excels at. They were always pushing the limits of what the 64 can do, and it's pretty apparent in Perfect Dark. The original game didn't run very well though, with a pretty abysmal frame rate. Perfect Dark is a game that was stuck in a pretty bad situation. It was restricted to a console that wasn't powerful enough for its ambitions, being a new franchise meant that it was never as popular as its big brother Goldeneye, and Halo Combat Evolved revolutionising multiplayer FPSs a year later meant that Perfect Dark became dated pretty quickly. Today, it's a good game, but with some modern touches and adjustments, it could be great. If you're feeling tired of modern shooters, try Perfect Dark, and don't be ashamed to use a guide. Unless you're being constantly watched by some insane gaming purist, then you should probably call the police or something.